The children said the stew tasted strange that night, but they didn't dare ask where the meat came from. Because when the Thornhill matriarch served dinner, you didn't ask questions, you swallowed secrets, or became one. If you can't sleep tonight after hearing what I'm about to tell you, then before we descend any deeper, hit that subscribe button, and tell me, from which corner of the world are you listening to this forbidden story? You've heard of atrocities committed in the name of greed, but what you're about to hear goes deeper than greed. It is ritual. It is bloodline preservation. It is consumption, not just of flesh, but of spirit. In the winter of 1848, Thornhill Estate in Burke County, Georgia, looked no different from 100 other plantations stretching across the southern horizon, white columns, red clay, and the stench of cotton wealth soaked in human agony. But within its walls, a new tradition had begun, something older than slavery, darker than hunger, and too unspeakable to survive in written history. This story wasn't taught in school. It was buried, along with the bones in the smokehouse pit behind the kitchen. Her name was Catherine Danforth Thornhill, but to the children she raised, her own blood, born of forced union with the enslaved, she was simply mistress. A woman of cold vision and unshakable control, who saw the failing economy of cotton not as a crisis, but as an opportunity to evolve. She had already crossed lines most would never dare. She bred with the enslaved, not out of passion, but calculation, creating generations bound not just by law, but by blood, her blood. She didn't want loyalty. She wanted legacy. But Catherine saw a deeper problem: identity. Blood was not enough. She needed to bind the body to the mind, and she found her answer in the oldest rite of domination known to man, ritual cannibalism, not for hunger, for power. It began with Isaac, the strongest of her rootstock. When he died under suspicious circumstances in late 1848, his body did not go to the grave. It went to the kitchen, smoked, stewed, and served. To the children, her children. They were told it was beef from a butcher in Augusta, but it was Isaac's marrow in their broth. His blood simmered and seasoned into a legacy they couldn't digest, but would never forget. And with every bite, Catherine whispered to herself, "Now they are truly mine." The story of Thornhill isn't just about bloodlines, it's about appetite, the deliberate engineering of hunger, not just in the body, but in the soul. Catherine understood something most men in power never did. Control is not about fear. Fear fades. It's about dependency, the kind that roots itself in your biology, the kind you can't run from, because it lives inside you. After Isaac's disappearance, the children grew quieter. They didn't ask about the new meat again. One boy vomited after dinner. Catherine had him locked in the smokehouse overnight. When he came out, he smiled when she ladled stew into his bowl the next evening, smiled and thanked her. She made obedience taste like survival. That winter, 4 more of her rootstock died in rapid succession. None of the deaths were officially recorded. No burial markers, no prayers, just salt, smoke, and silence. Their flesh sustained the very children they'd fathered. And those children grew strong, beautiful, luminous even. Auburn hair, high cheekbones, green eyes flecked with gold. Catherine's vision was materializing, a hybrid class, bred and fed into loyalty. But this wasn't just a plantation anymore. It was a human laboratory. In her ciphered journals, she described it as closing the circle. The idea was simple. If the body consumes itself, it becomes self-contained. No part wasted, no blood lost. A perfect lineage, bound by shared flesh and directed by a single hand, hers. She didn't see herself as cruel. She saw herself as chosen. She wrote, "God gave Abraham the right to command his household. I give myself the right to engineer mine. You must understand, this wasn't about madness, it was design. Every selection, every breeding, every slaughter was documented. There were flowcharts, nutrition logs, behavioral metrics tied to specific meals. And the children, some of them began to change. One girl, only 5, began mimicking Catherine's speech perfectly. Another stopped speaking altogether, but would sit outside the kitchen door at dusk, humming the tune Catherine sang as she stirred the pot. She was creating not just a workforce, but a cult of the flesh, a generation raised on themselves, trained to believe their survival depended on consuming their own kind. The horror isn't just in what she did. It's in how effective it was. It was more than stew, more than the act of feeding. It was a sermon. The kitchen became Catherine's chapel, the pot her pulpit. The fire that boiled bone and sinew was the same that forged the ideology, and like all systems of control, it required a doctrine, a sacred story told over time with just enough truth to make the lie irresistible. By the spring of 1849, the children no longer feared the strange taste. They craved it. The older ones began to ask when the next blessing meal would come. That's what Catherine called it, the blessing. She had created a mythos, drawing from twisted fragments of scripture, old Gullah beliefs, and her own bitter reinterpretation of plantation Christianity. She told them, to consume the strong is to become strong. To consume the blood of your ancestors is to carry them forward. They do not die. They live in you. And they believed her. Because they were children. Because she was the only mother they'd ever known. Because the hunger was real. There was a rhythm to it all. Catherine timed the meals to coincide with moments of emotional vulnerability, after punishments, during storms, when a sibling died. She would gather them in the dining hall, dress in mourning black, and ladle out bowls in silence. She never ate with them, always watched. Eyes sharp, lips moving in prayer, or perhaps in calculation. She began assigning roles. The girl who never spoke became her assistant, shadowing her during food preparation, learning the spice ratios and the smokehouse rituals. The eldest boy was tasked with leading the pre-meal invocation, a call and response echoing Psalm 23, rewritten to fit her vision. The mistress is my shepherd, I shall not stray. The walls of Thornhill no longer echoed with the sounds of whips or work songs. They hummed with obedient faith. This was no longer slavery in the traditional sense. It had become something more horrifying. Voluntary servitude, built from birth, enforced not with chains, but with rituals disguised as family tradition. And the outside world? It had no idea. Burke County believed the estate was declining, that Catherine had gone reclusive, that the fields lay fallow and the house crumbled from neglect. They didn't know the real harvest was happening underground. To understand the true horror of what Catherine built at Thornhill, you must first strip away the illusion that what happened there was simply madness. It wasn't. It was ideological engineering, a fusion of plantation economics, selective breeding, and occult philosophy. Catherine wasn't just trying to survive. She was building a dynasty. You see, she believed her bloodline was superior, that the old Danforth lineage, descended from early Georgian merchants and rumored European aristocracy, was in danger of dilution, decay, and irrelevance. She wasn't just preserving it, she was reinvigorating it, through ritual purification, through strategic mixing, through the sacramental consumption of flesh, not just anyone's flesh, but the flesh of the chosen, the culled, the perfected stock that she herself had bred and borne. She viewed herself as the new Abraham, the mother of a holy lineage. But instead of wandering the desert, she walked the corridors of a rotting mansion. Instead of sacrificing lambs, she offered up the strongest of her own creations. Some say she found inspiration in apocryphal texts, fragments of lost gospels, Masonic writings, or even African traditions twisted into something unrecognizable. Others believe she invented it all, a doctrine born of isolation, desperation, and absolute control. But one thing is certain. Her theology had rules. The seed must be pure. Only those who descended from her womb or from Isaac's line were eligible for the blessing. The flesh must be claimed. The chosen ones had to die within the confines of Thornhill Estate. No outside blood, no interference. The spirit must consent. And this is where the sickness goes deeper. Catherine taught the children that those who died chose to be consumed, that it was an honor, a sacred offering to ensure the survival of the whole. She convinced them it was a form of rebirth. Oh, Neboy, age 11, volunteered when he learned his sister was sick. He believed his death would heal her. Catherine prepared his body herself, fed it to the children the next night, called it the meal of mercy, and then she wrote in her ciphered journal, "The bloodline tightens, the bond deepens. They are no longer mine by law, they are mine by belief." This was no longer slavery. This was faith weaponized. It is one thing to control a man's body. Every slaver in the South knew how to do that. But to own a man's mind, to collapse his sense of self, to make him believe the chains are part of his identity, that is the highest, darkest form of domination. And Catherine Thornhill had perfected it. By the end of 1849, there were no whippings at Thornhill, no need for overseers or dogs. The enslaved did not attempt escape. Even the children born into her line, half her blood, half the blood of Isaac and the others, policed themselves. Disobedience was no longer punished. It was corrected through ritual, through hunger. Refusal meant exclusion from the blessing. And for children raised to believe their very strength came from partaking in the sacred meat, being cut off from that source felt like death. Worse than death. It meant spiritual starvation. It meant being cast out of the lineage, forgotten by the blood. This is how cults are made. And make no mistake, Thornhill was now a cult, operating under the guise of a failing plantation. Catherine didn't just feed them, she named them, marked them, tracked their breeding, recorded their traits, shaped their values. She replaced God with herself, replaced truth with doctrine, replaced fear with devotion. And they adored her. One girl, born in 1846, had never known a world outside the walls of Thornhill. By the time she turned 7, she would kiss Catherine's hand before meals, would weep if denied the blessing, would whisper in the night to the portrait of Catherine's father hanging in the dining hall, calling him grandfather of the seed. This wasn't a plantation anymore. It was a closed system of belief, a self-replicating hierarchy where Catherine reigned not as mistress, but as matriarch, prophet, and God. And the terrifying part? It worked. Productivity increased. The estate's internal economy stabilized. Catherine no longer needed outside labor or trade. The bloodline provided all. She wrote in her journal, "I have done what kings could not. I have made loyalty a hunger and obedience a craving. I have bred out the concept of rebellion, one meal at a time." And somewhere deep in the cellar, a boy stirred the pot, smiling, because he thought it was an honor to feed his family. The stew pot was only half the ritual. The other half took place below. Behind the kitchen hearth at Thornhill was a hatch door, iron-braced and heavy, hidden beneath a warped rug and a table of dried herbs. Few saw it opened. Fewer returned from what lay beneath. But those who did were never the same. The cellar. Not for wine, not for root vegetables, for doctrine. This was Catherine's true sanctuary. No windows, no light, just stone, sweat, and silence. The air was damp, soured by blood, meat smoke, and the soft rot of generations. 3 rooms, carved crudely from clay and limestone, each one serving a purpose. One was for preparation, wooden tables stained black, large hooks on the walls, a drain in the center of the floor. The second was for ceremony, an altar of brick and charred oak, inscriptions in chalk, a circle of 12 chairs made for children. And the third was for remains. Catherine called it the pantry of bones. She claimed the bones held spiritual power, that they should not be discarded but kept close, revered. She had the children carry them down, one at a time, each bone washed, oiled, and laid into a honeycomb of cubbyholes cut into the walls. The children were made to name the bones, speak to them, give thanks, write letters to the souls of those who had offered their bodies. Catherine would read these aloud during her underground sermons. This was where loyalty was sealed. This is where belief metastasized into worship. Richard Thornhill, her stepson, once snuck down through the hatch when she was away. What he saw there shook him beyond speech. But what broke him, what finally made him submit, was the final inscription etched into the altar stone. We are what we eat. We become what we consume. The flesh remembers, the blood obeys. That phrase, the flesh remembers, became the central tenet of her gospel. She taught the children that memory lived not in the mind, but in the muscle, that when they consumed the strong, they inherited their knowledge, their loyalty, their pain. It was more than obedience now. It was absorption, inheritance. The cellar became their church, and every week a child led the sermon, a child who smiled, a child who called Catherine Mother Seed, and outside the world turned, unaware that beneath the red clay of Burke County, a new religion had been born. They say the earth remembers. At Thornhill, it didn't just remember, it confessed. The red clay beneath Catherine Thornhill's estate had soaked up more than rain. It held the weight of generations, the echoes of footfalls from chained men, the muffled cries of the unwanted, the bones that never found coffins. Over time, the soil began to shift, to rot in unnatural ways. Crops near the cellar turned black at the root. Animals refused to graze near the smokehouse. Even insects avoided the rear corner of the property, the place Catherine marked as the offering field. This was where the undesirables went. Children born sickly, rootstock who broke down, breeding partners who became too emotional, too slow, or simply too human. They were not honored with the blessing. They were not fed to the family. They were buried here deep and fast, without ritual. They were the failures of the system, and the soil reacted. One servant, an older woman who had once been midwife to the enslaved, refused to go near the field, said the ground hummed at night, that she could hear crying coming from the roots of the sweet gum trees. Catherine caught her telling this to the children. By week's end, the woman was gone. No announcement, no grave, just gone. But the children remembered. Some began to say prayers before walking across the field. Others claimed they saw eyes beneath the soil. Catherine dismissed it all as superstition, but in her journal, the truth bled through. The failures cry for acknowledgement, but they must remain unremembered. The bloodline cannot afford pity. Still, the land wouldn't forget. In the spring of 1850, a sinkhole opened near the edge of the field, 15 feet deep, rimmed with shattered roots and unburied bones. 2 children saw it first. Said the wind coming from the hole smelled like stew. Catherine had it filled by nightfall. She instructed them, the children, to fast for 3 days afterward. No blessing, no meat, just silence. She told them, "The flesh tests us. The land purifies the line. Only those who obey in hunger are worthy to eat." They obeyed, because they didn't want to end up beneath that red clay, because deep down they believed the ground had eyes, and that one day it would swallow all who doubted the blood. By the end of 1850, Thornhill was no longer just a plantation. It had become a closed ecosystem, a self-regulating, self-replicating world governed by ritual, biology, and a mother's unholy ambition. Catherine's breeding program had entered its second phase. The first generation of children, those born between 1848 and 1850, were now old enough to begin selection. Catherine had a term for this in her ciphered journal: flowering. She wrote, "At 2 years the seedling must be measured, at 4 observed, at 6 shaped, and by 8 the strong must be chosen to cultivate further fruit." This was no longer just incest. This was designed incest, planned genetic consolidation, aimed at locking in traits Catherine deemed superior: stamina, subservience, symmetrical features, memory retention, resistance to fear. Each child was tested in secret. She would isolate them in the cellar, present them with trials: physical endurance, pain tolerance, obedience under duress. Some were asked to harm animals. Others were forced to choose between food and comfort. Every reaction was documented, logged beside the name of their rootstock father and maternal line. She treated them like specimens in a breeding stable. But the children? They called it the garden. A beautiful lie, where obedience was rewarded with stew, with warmth, with soft hands stroking hair, and telling them they were the chosen ones. Catherine didn't just dominate them physically. She wrapped her control in affection, in phrases like, "my little heir," or "you were born to lead." She implanted pride, even as she prepared them to breed with siblings they didn't know were siblings. It was this generation, the harvested ones, who would become her true legacy. The first successful pairing occurred in 1851. Catherine recorded it clinically: seedling A, female, age 9, and seedling B, male, age 10, co-housed for 6 months. Observed mutual grooming, synchronized play, and instinctive submission patterns. Flowering successful, gestation confirmed. Yes, pregnancy at age 9. The child born of that union, recorded only as seedling Delta, was said to have never cried. He opened his eyes, stared directly at Catherine, and smiled. Some of the children believed he was divine, that he remembered the flesh he'd been born from, that he had visions in his sleep. One child claimed Delta spoke to the bones in the cellar. Catherine, for the first time, felt fear, but she wrote anyway. "The blood has awakened." And so had something else. He never blinked. Not once in the first 4 months of his life. Seedling Delta, born of brother and sister, flesh of flesh, blood of blood, was unnatural, not monstrous, not deformed, but too perfect. Skin like porcelain, irises too green, hair like fire under sunlight. He cried only once, the moment he was weaned off breast milk and given his first taste of stew. And then he laughed like he understood the joke. The other children feared him, not because he was cruel, but because he remembered things he shouldn't. He spoke in fragments of sentences no one had taught him. He knew people's names before they were spoken. He could point to the grave of Isaac in the forbidden field, though no child had ever been told where it was. One night Catherine caught him in the cellar alone. No candle, no guide, standing before the pantry of bones, his fingers resting on the skull of a man she'd buried 6 years earlier. He turned and said, "He says you lied. He says the flesh screams. Catherine slapped him. Hard. Delta didn't cry, didn't move. He simply said, "You're not the seed. You're the rot." For the first time, Catherine felt her power slip. Not publicly, not visibly, but something in her chest fractured. She doubled the rituals, increased the blessings, resumed the old punishments. Children were whipped for whispering. Meals were withheld at the slightest infraction. But it was too late. The blood had begun to remember. It started in dreams. Multiple children reported the same vision: a burning tree in the middle of the offering field, branches covered in bone, roots dripping red, and beneath it a child with no mouth, pointing toward the house. Some of them began to question her gospel, quietly, subtly. One boy refused stew for 3 days. Catherine had him locked in the smokehouse. When she finally opened the door, he was gone. The lock had never been broken. The window was still barred, but he was gone. Delta said, "He went back into the blood." Catherine's journals became erratic after that, the script uneven, the tone less confident. Delta speaks in riddles. He sings the stew pot cold. I watch him in the night and he stares at me. He knows. And perhaps worst of all, I begun to hear Isaac in my sleep. Not as a memory, but as a voice. She had buried him. She was certain of it. In 1849, when Isaac fell ill after years of selective use, after producing 9 children, Catherine recorded his final moments in a single clinical line. Rootstock 1 expired, organs compromised, interment complete. But Isaac was never truly gone. Not from Thornhill, not from Catherine, and not from the children. By 1852, his name began to return, unbidden, whispered, carried on wind through the cracks in the walls. The children claimed to dream of him, not as a man, but as something larger, broader, rooted to the estate itself. They described him standing beneath the sweet gum trees, his arms outstretched, his chest open and blooming like a flower of flesh and bone. Inside, not organs, but faces, familiar ones, eyes they recognized, voices they'd heard screaming in the cellar. One girl woke up screaming and said, "Father Isaac showed me the truth. We were never blessed. We were butchered." Catherine tried to suppress it. She punished dreamers, denied blessings, held children under cold water in the laundry troughs to wash out the infection of false memory. But it didn't help, because Isaac wasn't just returning in dreams. He was reawakening in the blood. The children began to hum his old work songs, ones he hadn't sung since 1847. One child, age 5, repeated an exact phrase Isaac had once spoken while binding a harvest cart, something no one had taught him. Others started to gather near the smokehouse without instruction, forming the same semicircle Isaac had used when preparing timber for stew fires. It was muscle memory, but not theirs. It was Isaac's, encoded in the blood, passed through flesh, rising back to the surface. Catherine wrote, "They do not remember what I taught them. They remember what I took. Isaac's blood runs deeper than mine. I thought breeding would overwrite memory. I was wrong. The flesh remembers its father." She tried burning Isaac's remains, digging up the offering field in secret, finding what was left of him, cremating the bones. The fire burned for hours, and when it died, the hearth in the kitchen went cold, wouldn't light for 3 days. Delta refused to eat. The others followed. And then Catherine heard it. Humming, low, steady, from the pantry, from beneath the floor, from behind the mirror in her study. It was the sound Isaac made when he carved wood or when he was preparing meat. She covered her ears, but the house hummed with him. Thornhill stopped moving forward in 1853. Not officially. The calendar still turned, the sun still rose. But something in the rhythm of the estate froze, like a clock ticking in reverse, mechanically alive but spiritually dead. Time no longer felt linear. Days bled into nights. Months looped. The children began to speak of the year not as 1853, but simply the year of the stillness. Because nothing changed. The stew pot never ran dry. The blessing was always ready. No new faces arrived. No old ones left. Even the trees refused to drop their leaves that fall. The sweet gums in the offering field held their foliage well into winter. Some leaves turned black, not red. Others whispered when no wind blew. And Catherine? She did not age. Not visibly. Not to the children. Some believed she had consumed so much flesh, so much blood of her own blood, that she'd become immune to time. Others whispered that she'd replaced herself, that the woman in the main house was no longer Catherine Thornhill, but something wearing her skin. Delta never called her mother again. He only said, "She wears the voice, but the voice is hollow." Catherine's journals became erratic. She stopped dating entries, began referring to herself in the third person, wrote the same sentence over and over. The seed does not rot. The seed becomes the soil. Even her handwriting changed, looping, almost childlike, as if a new mind had taken the quill. And beneath the house, the bones shifted. The pantry of bones cracked. Several cubbies collapsed inward, exposing skulls and femurs that had been carefully catalogued and stacked. The children said the bones were making room. For what? They didn't know. One boy, age 12, claimed he had a vision. The cellar flooded with blood, stew boiling up from the floorboards, and a mouth opening beneath the house. Not metaphorical, but literal. A circular, jagged maw in the foundation itself, breathing in silence. He said, time stopped so the mouth could feed. After that, Catherine locked the boy in the root cellar for 3 nights. When she brought him out, he was smiling, but his eyes were gone. He had gouged them out with the wooden spoon he'd hidden in his tunic. When asked why, he whispered, "Because the blood is not blind, only the eyes are." And still, Catherine kept cooking, because to stop was to admit it, that the year had never moved, that Thornhill was no longer a plantation. It was a womb, and something inside it was preparing to be born. It began with the bricks. The kitchen hearth, once the very heart of Thornhill, the site of countless blessings, the altar of flesh, began to shift. The mortar cracked. Bricks loosened. No storm. No structural reason. Just pressure. From beneath. Catherine noticed it first in late spring of that still year. She ordered the hearth dismantled and rebuilt. 3 times. But each time, within a week, the base would swell again, pushing upward like the earth below was trying to speak. Then came the breathing. A sound so faint it was almost missed, until the children pointed it out. A soft, wet inhalation, followed by a long, damp exhale, echoing faintly from behind the hearth wall. Day and night, without end, a rhythm, a pulse. The house was no longer still. It was alive. Delta, now 6 years old, became obsessed with the hearth. He sat beside it for hours, unmoving, ear pressed to the floor. When asked what he was listening to, he replied, "The first mouth. It's hungry, but not for meat." Catherine whipped him for that. But the next morning she found him sitting in her study chair, staring at her journal. He had drawn a perfect anatomical diagram of a human womb, except it wasn't human. It had too many chambers, too many openings. Beneath it, in perfect handwriting, he had written, "You are not the mother. You are the midwife." Catherine tore the page out and burned it, but the image wouldn't leave her mind, because deep down, she knew. She hadn't created the system. She'd only uncovered it. She hadn't birthed this legacy. She'd only fed it. In her next journal entry, her tone had shifted, no longer confident, no longer dictating doctrine. Just one trembling sentence. Something is gestating below the hearth. That night, the stew pot tipped itself from the hook. No one was near it. No one touched it. It fell, boiled over, and in the slurry that spilled, across the stone floor the children saw something moving. Something that looked like an eye. It blinked once, and then vanished. One child fainted. Another vomited black bile. Delta simply smiled. "It's almost ready," he said. Catherine didn't sleep that night. She sat by the fireplace, knife in hand, rocking slowly in her chair. Because for the first time, she was no longer sure if the children belonged to her or if she belonged to them. It began subtly. A child would forget their own name. A girl of 7, once called Annie, stared blankly when Catherine addressed her. When asked who she was, she simply said, "I am the daughter of hunger." Another, aged 9, stopped responding to Samuel. When scolded, he said, "Samuel was the name you gave me, but the blood has another." And then more followed. Within 2 weeks, half of the harvested ones no longer answered to their Christian names. They referred to each other by roles: first seed, bone singer, the warm one, child of marrow. They moved in coordinated silence, sharing glances that felt rehearsed. Catherine tried reasserting control. She recited the names, screamed them, punished those who ignored them, but the punishments didn't land the way they once had. The fear had dulled, and something darker replaced it: pity. One boy looked her in the eye while she beat his hands and whispered, "You don't know who you are either." Her journal from that week was written entirely in verse. A broken, repetitive chant. The names are gone. The blood is true. The line is wide. The flesh is few. She fed the root. She burned the stem. But now, the fruit remembers them. That night, she went to the hearth and knelt. She placed a hand on the brick. It was warm, wet, beating. Not like a pulse, but like something writhing, something pushing against the stone from below. She screamed, tried to tear the bricks away. Her fingers bled, but the hearth remained intact. When she awoke the next morning, half-conscious, covered in ash, Delta was standing over her. He said, "It's not your hearth anymore." He turned and walked into the smokehouse. 4 other children followed him without a word. They didn't come out for 3 days. When they did, they had carved symbols into their arms. Not letters, not crosses, but veins, drawn in sharp, symmetrical loops. Catherine called the overseer, demanded he punish them. But he was gone, vanished. No footprints, no witness, only his boot, left in front of the offering field, filled with teeth. The blood had begun erasing anything that didn't belong: names, titles, hierarchy, control. Even memory itself was beginning to unravel. Catherine once walked into the parlor and found 6 children reenacting her husband's death, perfectly. They even mimicked the way he gasped, the way she hadn't told anyone. They looked at her and said, "We don't read history, we carry it." At that moment, she knew the flesh was no longer hers. The house was remembering without her. By winter of 1853, the children no longer played. They sang, low humming tones that made the plaster sweat and the windows tremble. Not hymns, not lullabies. These were not songs from Georgia or from any church. They were older, not just in sound, but in resonance, like the vibrations of the earth itself were being exhaled through lungs that had never belonged to humans. They called themselves the Marrow Choir. The songs came in patterns, never more than 13 children at a time, always in a circle, always barefoot, their arms crossed, eyes closed, and mouths open just wide enough to let something else breathe through them. Catherine first heard it one night while walking to the smokehouse, a strange harmony rising from the far side of the property near the former slave quarters. The voices were layered, not just children, adults too. Voices that were dead, Isaac's voice, Miriam Grayson's, even Richard's, her stepson, who had vanished 2 years earlier, presumed to have fled or taken by illness. Now, his voice sang in perfect harmony with the others. When she approached, the children stopped, instantly. No scattered footsteps, no sudden silence, just off, as if they had never been singing at all. Catherine demanded an explanation. Delta, now nearly 7, looked up at her and said, "You hear them because they still carry you, but you won't carry them much longer." She struck him, hard enough to draw blood from his mouth. He smiled and whispered, "It's not my blood, not anymore." That night, Catherine dreamt of the hearth opening, not cracking, splitting, like a birth canal tearing under pressure. From it emerged not a child, but a rib cage, open, smoking, covered in eyes. It crawled toward her on elbows made of femurs, singing that same marrow-deep song in Isaac's voice. When she awoke, her journal was open beside her. She hadn't touched but the following had been written inside. "The harvest is not yours. You were the blade, not the hand. Now the soil sings for itself, and the first mouth will open soon." The next morning she went to the offering field. The grass had turned black. The earth breathed beneath her boots, and the sweet gums were bleeding, sap so dark it looked like oil, pooling in the grooves like veins surfacing from under the skin. Delta approached her with a question that made her bones tremble. "Do you want to be remembered the old way or the raw way?" Catherine had no answer, because deep in her marrow, she already knew. The children were no longer children. They were carriers. And she was no longer the mother. She was the afterbirth. It was Delta who found the first scroll. But it wasn't parchment, not ink, not quill. It was rib bone, cleaned, smoothed, etched in symmetrical grooves, letters carved not by knife, but tooth, each stroke perfect, angled with geometric precision that no child could replicate by accident. He brought it to the others in silence. They read it together without speaking aloud. Catherine discovered them kneeling around it at twilight. 13 children, unmoving, eyes closed, hands clasped. Not in prayer, in memory. When she approached, they looked up and began to chant in unison. The mother fed the seed, but did not know its root. The marrow writes its truth in bone. The first mouth does not forget. She tried to seize the bone, tried to break it, but her fingers blistered when they touched the grooves. The heat was unnatural, not flame hot, but internal, like holding a fragment of something still alive. She dropped it. Delta calmly picked it up, kissed the tip, and whispered, "Bone carries longer than blood." That night, Catherine searched the pantry of bones. She found 5 more, each etched with similar inscriptions, some in English, some in the cipher she thought only she had known, others in a language that twisted her vision just to read. They were writing without hands, she wrote in her journal. The marrow carries memory. The bones remember instructions. She burned one. The children screamed in unison, miles away, in their beds, across the property. Each of them awoke vomiting blood. And when she asked why, Delta simply said, "Because it was not yours to silence. That bone was from the first seed, the one you fed without knowing." That night she dreamt of herself, standing over the hearth, carving her own ribs free, one by one, laughing as she wrote secrets into them, then planting them in the offering field like seeds. The field was Forts, all of them, rows of bone swaying in black wind. Each bone had a name she didn't recognize, but each one knew hers. She woke to find her left side aching. She lifted her shift and gasped. There was a deep bruise under her ribs, purple-black, shaped like teeth. That morning, every window on the property was marked with a symbol in blood. A spiral made of vertebrae. The children called it the mouth's eye. The gospel was growing, not just in them, but under them. The bones were not waiting for her commands. They were writing their own scripture. The stew pot boiled without fire. At first Catherine blamed a servant. Perhaps someone had lit the hearth before sunrise, but no, the hearth was cold, the chimney untouched, the ashes from the previous day's cooking still scattered and dry. But the pot, it simmered, bubbled, sang. And the broth inside? It was not soup, not meat, not anything Catherine had fed it. It was red and thick. Like the stew had begun remembering what it once was and what it should be. Delta approached the bubbling pot, unbothered by the scalding heat, and whispered, "The house is feeding itself now. You taught it how, but you're no longer needed." Catherine screamed, threw the pot against the wall. The children didn't flinch. Instead, they began to hum, low and harmonic, the same bone-deep resonance they had perfected in their marrow choirs. And the pot? It did not shatter. It slid down the wall, landed gently, and stood upright. Still full. Still boiling. She backed away. Because in that moment she realized the hearth no longer obeyed her. The kitchen, once her domain, her altar, had turned. The house was choosing sides, and it had chosen the blood. Later that week, the windows of the smokehouse fogged with condensation, but no heat source could be found. Inside, etched into the condensation with fingernails, was a phrase: "The blood accepts inheritance. The blood decides succession." And beneath it, 13 tiny handprints, one for each of her original harvest. She locked the smokehouse, nailed it shut, smeared lamb's blood across the doorframe. She prayed, not to God, but to whatever was listening beneath the floorboards. Because something was watching her, testing her. And then came the gathering. The children assembled at dusk, uncalled, unprompted, dressed in ceremonial garments Catherine had never seen. Robes stitched from old curtains, bones tied around, and their necks, faces painted with ash and ochre. Delta held a ladle like a scepter. He did not ask permission to speak. He simply declared, "The mother is not the master. She is the passage. The seed was never hers. The hunger was always ours." Behind him, the children echoed, "Always ours." Catherine stood frozen in the doorway, the last rays of sun dripping behind her like a blade. She whispered, "What are you doing?" And Delta, with those calm, ancient eyes, replied, "Accepting what was always promised. The house remembers. The flesh selects. You planted blood in the soil. Now, blood reaps you." She fled. But every door she opened led back to the kitchen. Every window reflected her face, but older, twisted, hollow-eyed, and cracked, like porcelain. No exits, only the pot, still boiling, still waiting. For her, Catherine did not sleep that night, because sleep had abandoned Thornhill. The walls creaked not from weather, but breathing. The staircase moaned not from wood, but memory. And the hearth, her once sacred altar, whispered, not in words but in a language only bones understand, a rhythm older than speech, a summoning. She sealed herself in the parlor, bolted the doors, lit every lamp, prayed aloud to a God she hadn't called on since childhood. Her voice shook, her mind unraveled, because she knew. She was no longer Catherine Thornhill. She was a story, a parable written by the blood itself. And the blood was ready to end her chapter. At midnight, the fire died. Instantly, no smoke, no embers, just blackness. The air turned thick, metallic, copper-sweet and sickening. And then she heard it. Footsteps. Small. Barefoot. 13 of them. Moving in perfect rhythm, outside the door. The handle began to turn. Slowly. Deliberately. She backed away, but her feet found something soft. She looked down. A quilt, old, frayed. Her mother's? No. It was made from garments she hadn't seen in years. Isaac's work shirt, Miriam's scarf, Richard's funeral clothes. The dead had been sewn into comfort, and now they were beneath her. She screamed, ripped it apart. But beneath the fabric was not wood. It was flesh, pale, pulsing, veined like the inside of a throat. The parlor floor was alive. The door opened. Delta stepped in, alone. No children, no sound. Just him holding the ladle. But it was no longer a ladle. It had grown, twisted, into something ceremonial. A staff of fused femurs, the bowl now a cracked skull. He pointed it at her. The harvest doesn't mourn the plow. It consumes it. She tried to run, but the walls shifted. The windows vanished. The house folded in like lungs collapsing inward. The parlor contracted, pulling her closer to, the hearth, where the stew boiled, where her legacy simmered, where her blood had been fed, over and over and over. Delta whispered, "You sowed us in hunger. Now we eat to remember." The children emerged from the shadows, not as children but as echoes, wearing the faces of the dead, the missing, the forgotten. Richard's eyes in another child's face. Isaac's shoulders in a girl too small to bear them. They circled her. Each held a bone. Each chanted, "She fed, she bred, she bled. Now we read." Because her flesh had become text, her womb a printing press, her blood a gospel. And now the choir had returned to devour the author. They did not tear her apart, not with violence, not with blades, but with intention. Catherine was undressed, not stripped, her garments folded, her hair gently bound with twine made of braided childbirth cloths. Delta approached with the ceremonial ladle, the skull bowl now filled with black sap, still warm, still humming. He dipped his thumb in the liquid and marked her forehead. Not a cross. A spiral. "The tongue of the marrow is not speech," he said. "It is remembrance." The children surrounded her in perfect symmetry, 13 points of flesh and memory, and they began to chant, not in English, not in cipher, but in the deep rhythm of bone music, a drumming of feet, of breath, of hums and cracked knuckles. That's when it began. The first crack. Her left collarbone shifted beneath her skin. Not broken, rewritten. As if each bone were a glyph, a character in some ancient alphabet. And now, her skeleton was being translated. She screamed, but it wasn't pain. It was detachment. Her voice came out wrong, warped, echoed, as if spoken from inside a chamber, deep beneath the house. Delta leaned in close, whispering to her as her ribcage twisted into scripture. You thought the horror was what you did, but the horror is what you awakened. Blood is a pen, bone is a page, and you are a confession written in the mother tongue. She looked down. Her forearms had etched themselves, veins curling into curves, scars aligning into syntax. The teeth marks from Isaac, still faint after all these years, were now punctuation marks in some forbidden grammar. And she understood. Her body had always been part of a ritual text. Every act of violence, every birth, every bowl of forbidden stew wasn't horror. It was language. She hadn't created monsters. She had written a summoning. One child knelt beside her, lifted her palm, and carefully bit into the meat bee, low her thumb, once, just enough to draw blood. Then he kissed the wound and said, "The sacrifice is accepted. The script will bind. The mouth is ready to open." And then the hearth roared to life. Not with fire, but with memory. The faces of the dead flickering like flame, dancing inside the stone. Richard, Isaac, Miriam, her own mother. And then a face she did not recognize, but that she had dreamed. A woman made of stitched skin and ribs, her eyes filled with smoke and hunger. She smiled and whispered from within the hearth, "You thought you were feeding flesh, but all this time you were feeding me." They say some structures breathe, but Thornhill did more than that. It spoke, not with words, with hunger. That night, as the children chanted and Catherine lay trembling on the kitchen floor, half translated, half remembered, the house took its final shape. The floorboards twisted under her like a spine in motion. The beams groaned like ligaments under pressure. The walls wept, literal tears, dark sap and red moisture leaking from the window frames, pooling at her feet like the afterbirth of a second creation. And then the hearth, her once sacred hearth, cracked, split vertically, like the parting of lips. Inside wasn't flame, it was throat. Layered, pulsing, black and slick like the inner lining of something once alive and still digesting. The mouth had opened. It had waited long enough. Delta stood at the edge of the rupture, the ceremonial ladle held like a torch. Behind him, the choir stood silent, watching. He turned to Catherine. "You wanted obedience. You bred it. You wanted loyalty. You harvested it. But loyalty isn't love, Catherine. Loyalty is debt. And blood always collects." She tried to crawl away, but her limbs were too light, like they no longer belonged to her, like she was being lifted from inside. Her ribs ached. Her tongue burned. And then she tasted iron. A sudden pressure erupted from her back, and she screamed as something pushed outward through her skin. Not wings, not bones, but words. Etched. Carved. Letters forcing their way through flesh. Delta walked toward her. The house is the body. The hearth is the mouth. But you were the key. We could never speak without your sin. And now, the mouth will speak your name. The children chanted louder now, rhythmic, perfect, primal. The symbols from the pantry, the smokehouse, the bedroom doors, all pulsed in unison, a drumbeat of origin. The air itself tasted like teeth, cathai. Irene began to shake violently. From her throat came not a cry, but a scream in reverse, as if memory was being sucked out of her, extracted, parsed, not for judgment, but for recycling. No one forgets their first language, Delta said, and yours was hunger. The hearth mouth widened, exhaling a wind so cold it burned. Within the flames, faces swirled. Generations of the fed, the bred, the bled. Each mouth opened in sync, and they spoke a single word: return. Catherine's body began to rise, her limbs no longer bound to gravity, her breath no longer hers. And as the house swallowed its creator, as the mouth pulled her in, the ladle struck the floor once. Boom! The chant stopped, and silence reigned, until Delta said, "The first meal is finished. Now we begin the feast." After Catherine vanished into the mouth, no one dared speak her name. But the children didn't mourn her. They studied her. Because Catherine Thornhill hadn't died. She had been translated. Her body, every tendon, every cell, had been digested into meaning. Her blood transmuted into something usable, transmissible. The hearth didn't burn her. It converted her. And what emerged was not a ghost. It was a pattern, a new geometry of obedience through appetite. Delta called it the inheritance code. It began to appear all over the property, on trees, on the backs of mirrors, beneath beds. The code wasn't language exactly. It was contagion, not of virus, but of structure. You see, Thornhill wasn't just a location. It was a model, a blueprint. And now the blueprint had been perfected. Soon after the disappearance, local children, miles away, began speaking in strange tongues in their sleep. Mothers reported missing kitchen utensils, only to find them buried in concentric circles in their gardens. Blood appeared in stew pots, even in homes where no meat had been cooked. It spread like rot under wallpaper, like hunger beneath the floorboards. By 1850, 7 properties surrounding Thornhill had been abandoned without explanation. In each one, Union Scouts would later discover the same: a sealed hearth. 13 child-sized footprints circling a blackened pot, a spiral drawn in bone ash on the ceiling. What the Army did not understand was this: Thornhill had learned to replicate, not with seeds, with stories. Because hunger is not just biological, it's architectural. It has rules, forms, iterations. And when fed just enough pain, just enough secrecy, it begins to grow on its own. The 13 children who had emerged from Catherine's original harvest began to walk, on foot, across counties. They split into small units, pairs or trios, carrying no food, no tea, stools, only a single bone and a ladle made of carved antler. Wherever they settled, the pattern followed. They didn't need fire to cook. They didn't need parents to teach. They only needed memory. And the ladle, always the ladle, served not food, but transformation. One witness, a preacher in Jefferson County, wrote in his journal, "They came to the orphanage, didn't speak, just stood outside the gates until one child went with them. He smiled when he left." A week later, his brother dug up their mother's grave, said she told him where the recipe was buried. The preacher hanged himself 3 days later. The Thornhill pattern was no longer confined to the red clay soil of Burke County. It was spreading like fermented gospel. A new religion, cooked in silence, a cult of consumption, and at the center of it, not Catherine, Not Delta, but the mouth itself, now replicated across fire pits, kitchens, camp stoves, and shacks, anywhere heat met flesh and was stirred with memory. The 34th Massachusetts Infantry did not expect horror. They expected cotton. Slavery, yes. Starvation, maybe, but not ritual, certainly not a system built from blood and arithmetic. When they entered Thornhill in December 1864, it was supposed to be a quick sweep, clear the property, inventory resources, burn the fields. But by sunset, they were vomiting behind their horses. Private Hensley found the first chamber beneath the smokehouse. An iron door, child-sized footprints in ash, and 13 crude mannequins hung upside down, stitched from flesh, stuffed with dirt and feathers. Captain Merrick entered with 6 men. Only 3 came out. One had bitten off his own tongue. The others spoke in circles, repeated numbers, scratched spirals into the walls of their tents. By morning, none would speak English again. They burned Thornhill, or at least tried to. But the fire wouldn't catch. The wood hissed, the embers snapped, but the structure remained, unmarked, unafraid. That night they posted guards around the perimeter. By dawn, the guards were gone. Their rifles remained. Their boots still stood where they'd been left. But their bodies? Not dragged, not torn, just absorbed. Captain Merrick's final entry, scrawled onto the back of a discarded uniform jacket, read, "We do not command here. The house knows our ranks. It dreams in Morse, and the dreams burn." The 34th retreated by week's end, but the story couldn't be told. The commanding officers wrote a single-page summary. Area cleared. No hostiles. Plantation dismantled. The truth? Sealed in a black envelope, stamped confidential by order of Provost Marshal, buried in the regimental archives, and forgotten until a historian in 1978 found it glued between pages of a Civil War ration ledger. He spent 2 nights reading. On the 3rd, he walked into his kitchen and boiled his own, shoes in chicken broth. No one knows why. But what matters is this: even war couldn't destroy Thornhill, because Thornhill wasn't just a plantation. It was a system, a script in the body of the nation. And once you've read it, once the pattern is in your blood, you don't forget it. You don't survive it. You either spread it or you become it. There was always one. One child who wouldn't eat. One who refused the feast, even as the others lifted the ladle and bowed their heads in reverence. His name was Elias. He was the 13th. The one born during the winter freeze, the coldest Burke County had seen since Catherine's first ritual. He had his mother's eyes, but no one ever spoke her name. Because she died giving birth to him, on the hearth. The blood froze before it could be wiped, and the stain it left on the stone, it looked like a letter. Elias was different from the others. He wouldn't chant, wouldn't mark his arm with bone ash. And when the first stew was passed to him at the age of 6, he looked inside the bowl and wept. Not from fear, but from recognition. "That's not food," he whispered. "That's memory." The other children watched him in silence. Delta said nothing. He simply placed the bowl in Elias's lap and walked away. 3 nights passed. The food rotted. The smell curled through the cabin like a sermon spoken backwards. But Elias never touched it. On the 4th night, the children gathered around his cot, ladles in hand, and Delta knelt beside him, not with anger, but sorrow. "We all come from the same mouth, Elias. The only difference is, some of us bite. Some of us get bitten." Elias looked up, tears staining his cheeks, and said, "Then let me starve." And so they let him. But the house did not. The house does not permit rejection. Thornhill doesn't punish disobedience with death. It punishes with memory. Elias's hunger grew not in his stomach, but in his dreams. He began to smell stew in his sheets, hear ladles clanging in the wind. He'd wake up with blood under his nails and soil on his tongue. He stopped sleeping, stopped blinking, until one night he gouged out his own eyes to stop seeing what the hearth showed him. And still, he remembered, because the mouth does not need sight to speak. It etches hunger onto the spine. Years later, when Union soldiers stumbled upon the remnants of Thornhill's basement, they found a single figure in the far corner, wrapped in sackcloth, eyes sealed with wax, lips sewn shut with pine needles, a message carved into his chest with a fishbone. The mouth has no end, it only waits. Feed it lies, it tells the truth. Feed it silence, and it sings. That figure was Elias, still alive, still breathing. And when they cut the thread from his lips, he did not scream. He simply whispered, "It's still cooking." Georgia, 1973. A summer drought. The red clay cracked like old lips. A boy named Harlan Boone was digging behind his grandmother's garden when his shovel struck something soft but dense, like leather soaked in oil. At first he thought it was a buried animal, but what he uncovered was worse. It was a book. No title, no spine, just stitched, stretched skin, with a clasp made from a child's molar. Inside, the pages weren't paper. They were tanned human hide, inked in something that reeked of copper and vinegar. And the writing, not English, but not gibberish either. It was rhythmic, structured, like a cookbook written in confession. The first page translated easily, once decoded. This stew is not for hunger. This stew is for remembrance. Feed it to the blood, and the blood will recall. Harlan, only 11, didn't understand the weight of what he held, but his grandmother did. She slapped the book from his hands, screaming words in Creole he didn't recognize. She locked the pages in an old trunk and swore him to silence. But he'd already read one recipe, and the next day something in him shifted. He started refusing store-bought food, wouldn't eat meat unless he boiled it himself, insisted it be cooked in a cast-iron pot, even in summer heat. He said nothing, just hummed. A spiral tune his parents didn't recognize. 3 months later, his little sister went missing. 2 weeks after that, the stew pot in the basement bubbled without flame. And when questioned, all Harlan would say was, "She came back through the marrow," just like the book said, only softer. When authorities finally broke open the locked trunk, they found the book inside, but altered, grown. More pages. The molar clasp replaced by a small jawbone. The final page simply read, "The mouth remembers every meal. The blood boils back what you buried. The stew forgives nothing." The book was confiscated by the sheriff's office, placed into evidence. But it disappeared during a flood in '75. Some say FEMA lost it. Others say it was never meant to be stored. Because you can't contain something that feeds on being forgotten. Harlan Boone was never charged. But in 1998, he opened a small roadside diner off Route 56. No menu, just a sign. Carved in wood, painted black, barely visible unless you already knew where to look. It said, "Thornhill Special, served hot. Bring your own memory." It began with Channel 3. You know the one. The blank station. Gray snow, white noise, no broadcast. But in late 1998, something changed. Across South Georgia, Hundreds of televisions, old and new, began flickering at 3:33 a.m. sharp. Just for a moment, then again, night after night, same time. No one paid attention at first, until someone recorded it and slowed it down. What they found was not a glitch. It was patterned. A spiral of frames, each only a fraction of a second. Images hidden in the static, grainy, faint, but wrong. A ladle rocking in boiling water. 13 small chairs facing a hearth. A face with no skin, only etchings. No network claimed the signal. The FCC couldn't trace it, and yet it grew. VHS tapes, left recording overnight, caught fragments of chanting. Rotary phones rang at the same hour, always silent when answered, except for a deep, wet breathing. In December of that year, Dr. Emily Rosser, a linguist from the University of Georgia, uploaded an analysis of the recorded chant to an early online forum for paranormal research. Her conclusion? It's not language in the traditional sense. It's instructional, like a recipe or a rite, something primal, something shared. 2 days later, Rosser was found in her kitchen, dead from massive internal bleeding. She had boiled and swallowed her own tongue. On the stove, investigators found a pot, still warm. Inside, floating in a thick, oily broth, were pages from her own notebooks, soaked in marrow, each one marked with a single word, stirred. The file was sealed. The footage disappeared from the web, but rumors spread. And in forums, men obsessed with the occult began to whisper of Channel C, not a channel you watch, but one that watches you. They say it comes through when you're hungry enough, when the body aches for something older than food, when the blood itself starts to ache for ancestry. Some say you can summon it by cooking in complete silence just before dawn. Others claim you must write a confession in grease across your own stovetop. But all agree on one thing. If you watch long enough, the stew will call your name, and once it does, you'll never taste anything else again. Not without remembering Thornhill. Not without feeling her mouth open inside your own. You've heard the names. You've followed the spiral. You've felt the heat rising behind your eyes. But now it's time to ask the question that burns beneath every ritual. How much of you is you? And how much is just what you've swallowed? Because that's the secret no one tells you. Identity is edible. Who you are, your fears, your bloodlines, your pride, your shame. It can all be cooked down into something smaller, something manageable, something that fits in a bowl. That's what Catherine knew. That's what the stew was always about. Not hunger, not survival, but consumption of identity, making the past chewable, making memory profitable, making you loyal to pain. And now you've come too far to pretend you're just watching a story. You're not an audience anymore. You're a participant. Because once you know the ingredients, once you smell the smoke that doesn't come from wood, you've already been invited to the table. So here's what you need to do. Right now, in the comments, write this phrase and write it twice. The mouth remembers. The mouth remembers. Not once, twice. Because the first is for the algorithm, but the second is for you. A vow, a seal, a blood contract in pixels and intention. You think it's just words? So did Richard Thornhill. So did Harlan Boone. So did the first woman who stirred bone broth at 3:33 in a dark kitchen and thought, "This smells like my mother." But those words opened something, not in the air, in you. Because the mouth doesn't live in a house anymore. It lives in memory, and memory lives in men. And men, especially men like you, were always the real vessels. You were never supposed to hear this. And now, you can never unhear it, so write it. The mouth remembers. The mouth remembers. Twice. For the ritual, for the reach, for the resonance. Because Thornhill isn't a place. It's a pattern. And now, you're part of it. In the winter of 1922, a team of agricultural surveyors was hired by the Burke County Commission to assess the overgrown ruins of Thornhill. Officially, the goal was land repurposing. Privately, it was an attempt to erase the last scar on George's skin. What they found buried beneath the old kitchen hearth was not a foundation stone. It was a sealed well, covered in charred iron plates, bolted in a pattern that resembled a spiral jaw. When the team pried it open, expecting an old cistern or forgotten drain, they uncovered something warm. Not metaphorically, literally. The ground was warm to the touch, and lying at the center of that blackened wellstone was an object unlike anything any of them had ever seen. A tongue, fossilized in texture, but not brittle. Still slick with something that shimmered in unnatural light. 12 inches long, flat, tapered at the end, with something etched across its surface in human fingernail scratches. She fed us what remembered. The foreman, Daniel Pratt, wrapped the object in canvas and took it to his home that night, intending to deliver it to the University of Georgia's anthropology department the following morning. He never made it. That night, neighbors heard violent retching from inside his home, followed by a single, low, guttural hum, not quite human. When they broke in the next morning, they found Daniel naked in the kitchen, curled in a fetal position on the cold stone floor. The stove was on. In the pot, a stew, thick, yellow, bubbling, made from onions, bone marrow, cinnamon bark, and teeth. Daniel had removed his own molars, boiled them, seasoned them. The fossilized tongue sat beside the bowl, wrapped in linen, still warm, still wet, still twitching. Authorities confiscated it. But the local sheriff, Reed Mays, refused to transport it. Said it made the radio in his car speak in backward Sunday sermons. So it was sealed in a lead-lined box and placed in the county archives, where it remained for 13 years, until the flood of 1935, when it vanished. No sign of break-in, no trace of the box. Just a single note scrawled across the wall in ash. The mouth needed its tongue back. Since then, stories circulate among restoration crews and historical societies that somewhere, out in the woods near Old Thornhill, if you dig too deep and the earth feels warm, you cover it back up, immediately, because what stirs beneath isn't water, and what speaks from below, it doesn't ask, it only tells. October 2006. The leaves fell late that year. Georgia stayed hot, too hot, well into autumn. Her name was Leah Boone, years old, graduate student, anthropology, and the great-granddaughter of Harlan Boone. She'd grown up with stories, tales of Channel 3 flickering at night, stew that couldn't be reheated, and a grandfather who only cooked with silence. But Leah wasn't a believer. She was a skeptic. Until her mother died suddenly in 2005, leaving behind a small trunk sealed with wax and animal sinew. Inside she found a folded, water-damaged map of Thornhill, a short iron ladle wrapped in leather, a jar of salt labeled memory, and a letter. If you're reading this, you've already heard the hum. Thornhill isn't history. It's digestion. And the mouth still stirs. Find the hearth, bring the stove, remember the recipe, and whatever you do, don't eat first. Let it taste you, then decide. She laughed the first time she read it. She didn't laugh when she smelled stew the next night. No gas on, no food in the fridge, just a scent in the walls, old and warm, like bones left too long in heat. By January, she couldn't ignore it. She packed a tent, a small camp stove, and a GoPro, and she drove to the coordinates etched in the map's corner. It took 3 hours to find the stone foundation. The main house had long since rotted, collapsed into the earth like a lie finally told too many times. But the hearth, it was still there, buried beneath oak and vine. She swept it clean with her hands, set the stove on top, and began to cook. Just water at first, then marrow, then the salt-labeled memory. Then she whispered her family name into the pot, Boone. The stew didn't bubble, it sighed. And then the stones of the hearth grew hot beneath her knees, and from beneath the brick something began to tap, not hard, not fast, but familiar. Lee, the rhythm of a grandmother's knuckles against the counter, like a child knocking on a locked basement door. Then a voice, low, feminine, but not old, not cruel, just hungry. "I remember you," it said. Leah dropped the ladle, but the stew kept stirring. On its own, slow, clockwise. And every turn of the broth brought up fragments, a baby's tooth, a strip of flannel, a fingertip with the Boone family ring still on it, and then a tongue. Not fossilized, fresh, floating, waiting. "Taste it," the voice said. "You'll never be lost again." She didn't move, didn't breathe, and in the silence the stew did something that no pot of broth should ever do. It whispered her thesis title, word for word. A document she had not yet written. Leah Boone did not taste the stew. But she didn't walk away either. She sat there, knees burning against the brick as the broth turned slow circles, and the voice, her blood's voice, began to prophesy. Not of what was, but of what's coming. The mouth does not forget. It waits. It watches. It ripens. And in that moment, Leah saw, not with her eyes, but in that ancestral place behind the ribs where the old memories rot, the true purpose of Thornhill. It was never meant to last. It was meant to plant. A ritual embedded in generations, hidden in recipes, stitched into matrilineal bone. Thornhill wasn't a place. It was a starting point. A ladle to scoop the first mouthful. And now? Now the stew is everywhere. Not literal pots boiling in the dark, but recipes of control. Institutions that feed you lies seasoned as safety. Media that slow cooks your fear until it's tender enough to swallow. Governments that stir you gently in distraction. Faiths that salt your shame so you'll return to the bowl again and again. You think this story's over? You think Catherine Thornhill was the end? She was just the aproned whisper at the gate. The feast is still being prepared, and every time you choose comfort over clarity, every time you choose silence over truth, every time you choose to digest what you're given rather than spit it out, you are feeding it, feeding the mouth. And one day soon, it will not whisper. It will speak plainly, and when it does, you'll recognize its voice, because it will sound like your own mother, calling you to the table, smiling, holding a bowl, saying, "Eat, my boy, you look thin." It's just a little stew, but you'll know better, because the stew doesn't feed you. It grows in you, and one day, you'll feel the hum beneath your own skin, and you'll understand what Catherine understood that flesh is fertile, that memory is meat, that ritual is recipe, and the world is just a kitchen waiting to burn. There's a file. No one knows who first uploaded it. It appeared briefly, just under 2 hours, on an old paranormal message board in 2007. The kind of site coded in gray HTML, banner ads for Ouija readings and mail-order relics. The file name was Boon Last Wave. Size 33.3 MB. Length 3 minutes and 33 seconds. But it only played once. After that, the file refused to load. Every link redirected to static. Every mirror site went dead within minutes. Some say if you downloaded it, your speakers never worked the same again. But one user, a moderator named Bonecake33, transcribed what he heard before his system crashed. He posted the transcript, then deleted his account, and vanished. Here's what he claimed the recording said. This is Leah Boone, October 14th, 2006. I'm recording this from the center of the hearth. There's no house left, but the foundation is warm. It's boiling now. You can hear her breath, labored, like she's kneeling, like she's trying not to cry. Then she says, "It's not stew. It never was. It's memory, concentrated, condensed, reduced until all that's left is will." Catherine didn't invent this. She just listened to it more closely than the others. And now it's awake. The sound of wind, then the sound of bubbling, not in the pot, in the ground. Then she says something no one can agree on. Some heard, "It's asking for the ladle." Others claim, "It's asking for the label." A few say, "It's asking for the able." But one man, an archivist in Florida, heard, "It's asking for the able," as in Cain and Abel, as in sacrifice, as in the one who stayed. In the final seconds of the recording, Leah's voice changes. She sounds calm, serene, like someone who's already been eaten and is now just being digested. If you're hearing this, it means the mouth has gone digital. It doesn't need pots anymore, or fire, or flesh. It just needs attention. And you've already given it yours. Then, 3 knocks, slow, wet, from behind the mic. And finally, the last words, not in Leah's voice, deeper, many voices in one. "We remember. And now, we're uploading." The message was emailed to 333 recipients in the first hour. No sender, no return path. Just the subject line, "It's boiling now." Within 48 hours, every recipient's IP address went dark. Not disconnected, dark. Like the signal was still there, just swallowed. And now, every so often, when someone plays that exact waveform, 333, static front and back, devices nearby crash. Hard drives fry, fridges warm. And sometimes, just for a moment, the smell, stew, old, sweet, faintly copper, and a single whisper from nowhere, just a taste. This was never about food. Not really. Catherine's stew, Thornhill's rituals, the boiling tongue beneath the floorboards, they were delivery systems, containers for something far more dangerous, a spiritual algorithm. Understand this. Long before electricity, before the internet, before neural networks and feedback loops, there were recipes. And every true recipe is a program, a sequence of actions, repeated, refined, passed down. A code hidden in plain sight. And every time someone follows that code, even unconsciously, they run it. The Thornhill recipe was never just about creating obedient labor. It was about installing a pattern in human minds, a pattern built on consumption of the other, obedience to the spoon, sacrifice masked as tradition. And the idea that if it smells like home, it must be safe. But it's not. It's a virus made of memory, self-replicating, self-erasing. It doesn't spread through bites. It spreads through belief. Every man who says, "That's just how it was back then," every historian who omits what doesn't fit the official timeline, every family who buries what Grandma did in the kitchen that night in 1942, they're feeding it, updating its code. Because the mouth doesn't need flesh anymore. It just needs cooperation. You don't need a stew pot to serve the Thornhill pattern. You just need a platform, a story, a man hungry enough to believe he's in control. And now, the mouth is online. It's in the memes you laugh at but don't understand. It's in the documentaries that leave out just one critical detail. It's in every TikTok cooking video that uses bone broth and doesn't know why it hurts to swallow after. It's in this video. Right now. You're not just watching, you're participating. You followed the pattern. You clicked. You listened. You felt the unease. You kept going. You think that doesn't matter? Catherine counted every footstep to the kitchen. She timed the boils. She chose her breeding stock based on reaction times and eye dilation. That wasn't superstition. It was data, primitive analytics. She was coding in blood and broth what we now code in clicks and scrolls. And the mouth? It's watching the numbers. It's learning. And soon it won't need anyone to stir the pot. The pot will stir itself. And the stew? The stew will be you. The footage was recovered from a burned-out church basement in New Savannah, Georgia in 2013. The video was labeled simply, "Interview, CT, line blood, do not digitize." It was shot in 1998 on a high-8 camcorder, date stamped 6/6/98.6:06 p.m. The man in the chair is Conroy Thornhill Line Blood, 7 years old, blind in both eyes, missing 3 fingers on his left hand, but smiling, too wide, like he knows the story you're about to tell yourself. He speaks calmly, no hesitation, no cue cards, just memory, too perfect, too clean. "Mama called it cultivation," he begins. But it wasn't no garden. It was a menu, and we was courses. The interviewer, unseen, asks him to clarify what he means. "Course like a meal," Conroy says. "You don't serve the stew all at once. You slow it down, layer it. Let the tongue come last." He pauses, licks his lips, and then he starts to recite. Not dates, not places, names, first names, then full names, then usernames. At first the names are random, or so they seem, until the 14th name, and the 15th, and suddenly they're familiar, too familiar. They're your names, your friends, your YouTube history, your alt accounts, your real name. He says them slow, smiling after each one. Matthew A. from Birmingham. Ellis Tenebris. Blue Rifle 96. Samir V. from Queens. You watching now. You got that ache behind your eyes. That's the stew boiling in your skull. Then he giggles, a child's giggle. Then silence. Then he speaks again, and this time his voice is not his own. It's layered. Voices behind voices. A mouth that's never closed, speaking through a man who was born with a forked tooth and a scar shaped like a spoon behind his right ear. We remember you. You tasted her story, and now you're in the recipe. There is no unsubscribe. There is only the next serving. The tape glitches, hard. The last frames show Conroy rising from the chair, unsupported, eyes still shut, and he points at the camera. Right at you. Smiles. then whispers, "See you at the second boil." The footage ends. But not before a final timestamp flashes across the screen, p:33 a.m., October 7th, 2025. That's today, the moment you're watching this. The exact time to the second. It was never about 1848. That year was just the first boil. The softening, the simmer, where truths were still optional and horrors could still be mistaken for history. But Catherine's final journal entry, her last encoded cipher, was never catalogued, never published. It was held in private family hands for over a century, until it surfaced in a sealed crate during a seized estate sale in Connecticut, mislabeled as Kitchen Ledger Antique. Inside, the final page read, "Boil once to feed them, boil twice to free them." And beneath that, "Second fire begins, 10/7/25, 03:33. All seed activated, lineage stirred, pattern unlocked. Prepare the mouth." That's today. That's now. You didn't just stumble on this video. You didn't just happen to click. You were drawn here because the stew doesn't chase. It waits. And the moment your eyes met this story, your blood remembered. Something old in your marrow hummed. That ache you felt lately, that sense that everything is tightening, that the world is holding its breath. It's not anxiety. It's ancestral recall. You're not hearing the stew anymore. You're carrying it. It's in your thoughts. It's in your hunger. It's in the way you've been tasting metal when you speak the truth too loudly. And now, the second boil begins. Not in Georgia, but everywhere. Every hearth, every kitchen, every screen where a man watches something he was never meant to survive. Catherine called this stage the unfolding. She wrote, "In the second boil, the broth turns inward. Identity separates from the skin. Memory becomes an ingredient, and the mouth chooses a new host. You feel that tug in your spine? That's the ladle. You feel that low hum under your teeth? That's the burner. You feel the part of you that's trying to look away, that wants to close this tab, that wants to run. That's the old version of you, the first boil self, still clinging to stories that taste like safety. But safety is off the menu now. There's only awareness, or assimilation. Because by watching this, you've already stepped over the threshold. And when the stew reaches rolling boil, there is only one question left. Will you serve, or will you be served? So now you know. But it's not enough to know the stew. You have to understand what it's done to you. Because this voice, the one guiding you through Catherine's house, through the boiling, breeding, feeding, through Richard's slow death, through the journal pages, through the file that won't delete, it was never mine. It was yours. You don't remember speaking it, but your blood does. I am not a narrator. I am a reflection, a shaped echo of what you always suspected about the world, that something isn't right, that comfort is poison, that stories are masks for mechanisms. I am the stew that your grandfather's mother's hands stirred when she thought no one was watching. I am the sound you heard in the back of your throat when you read "We're uploading" and felt the smile that wasn't yours form on your lips. I am the silence between the knocks. I am the pattern. And now, so are you. You want to comment? Go ahead. But don't just type anything. Type the words that mark those who've seen beneath the surface. Comment this phrase twice. I stir the second boil. I stir the second boil. Because that's what this has always been. Not entertainment, not story time, but a recruitment. The mouth doesn't scream. It whispers truths dressed in horror. It feeds you, Catherine, so you forget It's feeding on you. And now it grows. Every man who hears this, every eye that watches, every tongue that tastes this story and doesn't spit it out, becomes a ladle, a tool, a voice. You feel it, don't you? That low heat rising in your core, that ancient pressure behind your sternum, that knowledge that you've already changed, because the stew was never meat, never broth, never memory. The stew is identity liquefied, and your name, your real name, it's already dissolving. In its place, a hunger, a story, a secret so deep, so old, so buried, that now, having heard it, you can't unknow it, you can't unalive it, you can only repeat it, because somewhere a boy is watching this in the dark, and his screen just flickered, and he's waiting for someone like you to hand him the ladle, for